third term for President Trump? Hi, I'm Philip Blumel. Welcome to No Uncertain Terms, the official podcast of the Term Limits Movement. This is episode number 261, published on April 7th, 2025.
Your sanctuary from partisan politics.
President Trump, only a couple months into his second term, said in a March 30th interview with NBC News that there are methods for him to serve a third term in the White House. Now, he's suggested this before, usually in apparent jest to rile his opponents, and maybe that's what's happening here. I'm not going to get all up in arms about this unless we see an actual move in that direction. But the exchange on NBC News is a good excuse to take a look at the 22nd Amendment and see why any attempt at a third term is highly unlikely to succeed. But this review won't be purely academic. According to a 2020 study, about a third of all term-limited presidents globally have tried to remain in power after the end of their maximum allowed tenure. So we'll come back to that idea later in this podcast. First, let's hear how the mainstream media is talking about this story. Here's a report from Good Morning America on ABC.
Latest on President Trump considering running for a third term, an idea that would require violating the Constitution's term limits for presidents. Let's go back to our chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce. Good morning again, Mary.
Good morning again, Michael. Well, this would defy the Constitution, but President Trump this morning says he is considering his options to serve another term in the White House. In a phone interview with NBC, Trump saying, quote, "There are methods which you could do it," including possibly urging his vice president, J.D. Vance, to run and then cede power back to Trump. The president saying that's one method, but there are others too. Now, when asked to clarify, Trump doubling down, saying, "I'm not joking," but then adding it is far too early to think about it. And overnight on Air Force One, the president declined to answer when asked point blank if he is planning to leave office in 2029. Now, this is an idea that Trump and his allies have publicly been toying with for months, but a third term, of course, would violate the 22nd Amendment of the Constitution, which says, quote, "No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice." Now, he could, of course, try to amend the Constitution, but that is a very tall order. George.
But, Mary, even that vice presidential idea would violate the Constitution. The 12th Amendment to the Constitution says that no one can run for vice president who's ineligible to run for president.
Yeah, George, there are a lot of legal questions about how the president would practically try to do this. But again, this is an idea that he simply is not willing to let go of.
Next, let's look at the 22nd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice. Now, that seems to be pretty simple and ironclad. You can only be elected twice. That means no third term, right? Of course, that was the intent of the amendment. The two-term or 8-year tradition goes all the way back to the Constitutional Convention, where the founders argued about the issue quite a bit. Actually, in terms of time, there is no other issue which took up more discussion time at the 1787 convention than the length and number of terms the president should have. The most common term limits suggested at that time were a single 6 or 7 term limit or a two-term 8-year limit. Despite all that debating, they never did agree on a proper term limit, and there was not one included in the original draft of the Constitution. In the state conventions created to ratify the new U.S. Constitution, however, Virginia, North Carolina, and New York all officially called for constitutional amendments to include 8-year presidential term limits, but these did not make it into what we now call the Bill of Rights. In any case, the two-term, 8-year limit won out as an informal term limits tradition right out of the box. President George Washington famously relinquished power after 2 terms. President after president explicitly pointed to this tradition in not running for third terms, including Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson. Now, when some presidents flirted with the idea of running for a third term, their trial balloons were shot down on a bipartisan basis by an angry public. According to Martin B. Gold in his exceptional book, The 22nd Amendment and the Limits of Presidential Tenure, the initial challenges to the two-term tradition came from the Republican Party, with President Ulysses S. Grant in 1876 and 1880 also, and Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. In each case, Democrats led the defense of the two-term tradition. As Gold points out, talk of a third term for Grant roiled the midterm election. Grant failed to renounce interest, stoking Democratic turnout in 1874. This midterm election disrupted Republican dominance of Congress that had existed since the end of the Civil War. In 1875, Representative William Springer, Democrat of Illinois, led the House in passing a resolution declaring a third-term bid to be contrary to the public interest. It was the consolidation of power by FDR due to the Depression and the World War that led to his violating this tradition. The backlash to his 3+ terms led to the hearings and then to adoption of the 22nd Amendment. So, back to Trump. NBC News asked Trump what these methods might be to get around the apparent two-term maximum. The interviewer was asked about a scenario in which Vice President J.D. Vance could run for president with Trump as VP and then resign, passing the role to Trump. After all, Trump wouldn't technically be elected to a third term. Is this a loophole in the 22nd Amendment? First, let's get this out of the way. The idea is quite fanciful. Is J.D. Vance going to win a presidential campaign, which is no walk through the park, and then simply hand off power to someone else? An 82-year-old to boot. Are the voters who would naturally be in on this ploy go along with this? No way. But let's just say this occurs. The Supreme Court would naturally read the amendment in its technical wording and, of course, looking at its intent. Paul Gowder, a professor at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, has written that the loophole argument is pretty implausible. The argument defeats the clear intent of the 22nd Amendment, Gowder said. The guy who wrote the text that got adopted as the amendment stated on the record his understanding of what Congress was trying to do in drafting it, to quote, prevent a man's deliberately using the office of president in order to perpetuate himself in office, that is, for more than 2 terms. Close quote. And if you believe in the loophole, not only does it mean that Trump could have more than 2 terms, it means that Trump could be president for life, just so long as he could keep finding people to occupy the top of the ticket. All right, thank you, Professor Gowder. Now let's go out on a limb here and suggest that 2/3 of the Congress and 3/4 of the states that adopted the 22nd Amendment had nothing of the sort in mind. There can be no reading of history or the hearings that would lead an honest person to suggest the intent of the amendment was to do anything else but to codify the long-standing 2-term, 8-year term limit that had existed since the founding of the country. You know, and interestingly, I've seen a lot of such cases on the local level where politicians will attempt some gimmicky way to get around their 8-year term limit. For instance, in 2016, I wrote an amicus brief in a case in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida, where a city council member faced a 2-term limit. He resigned early from his 2nd term in order to run for a 3rd term, saying that the partial one didn't count. The court was not convinced. In fact, the courts hardly ever fall for these pranks. I'm sure there's such cases out there, but I can't think of one off the top of my head, and I've been around this block before. Term limits are intended to limit terms. It sounds absurd to say it. Of course it's hard to convince a court otherwise. I love how Professor Gowder put it. He said, it's improper to take a provision that obviously means no more than 2 terms and cook up a Bond villain-esque scheme to interpret it to mean, yes, more than 2 terms.
This is a public service announcement.
Okay, let's take a quick break from this discussion to look back at candidate Donald Trump in 2016, who is seen as a supporter of term limits, at least for Congress. He has repeated his support for the idea since, both before and after teasing the press about running for a 3rd term as president.
But there's another major announcement I'm going to make today as part of our pledge to drain the swamp. If I'm elected president, I will push for a constitutional amendment to impose term limits on all members of Congress. They've been talking about that for years. Decades of failure in Washington and decades of special interest dealing must and will come to an end. And remember, by the time this ends, I will have spent over $100 million on my campaign. Hillary spent nothing. She gets all her money from the special interests and donors. And my interest is you. My interest is you.
Since then, we haven't seen much action on either promoting congressional term limits or amending presidential term limits. Okay, now, can the 22nd Amendment be repealed or amended? After all, there is such a bill circulating in the U.S. House right now, introduced by Representative Andy Ogles of Tennessee, who would allow a third term. You know, amending the Constitution is a big lift, and it's that way on purpose. As you know, if you're a regular listener, U.S. term limits is trying to pass an amendment, a constitutional amendment, to limit the terms of the Congress. We have over 150 pledged supporters and co-sponsors in the Congress, and 11 states have officially applied for an amendment proposing convention to write one. We have been working on this strategy for about 8 years. It's not easy, even for an amendment that has support from big majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. Now, imagine running a similar campaign to weaken term limits. You can ignore those scary memes you're hearing about this. No one, including Representative Ogles, believes this is going to happen. His bill has 0 co-sponsors as of today. And this is why I'm not so alarmed by the president hinting at a third term. It ain't happening in the USA. Now, abroad is a different story. The desire of politicians to fight to obtain, to expand, and to clinging to power is universal. So, I go back to the study I started this podcast with. According to an article in The Atlantic in 2020 by Tim Horley, Ann Meng, and Mila Virstig, titled "The World is Experiencing a New Form of Autocracy," about a third of all term-limited presidents globally have tried to remain in power after the end of their maximum allowed tenure. Such heads of state, according to the study that fueled this article, have resorted to 4 main strategies to evade their term limits. Amending the Constitution to amend the term limits is the most popular one. A good example here is Rwanda's Paul Kagame. He claimed that popular demand justified putting the constitutional change back on the ballot. And it turned out that 99% of voters wanted to weaken the term limit. Of course, no one anywhere believed it was a fair election. In China, where elections are a capitalist extravagance, Xi Jinping relied solely on the popular demand argument and simply got the rubber stamp legislature to rubber stamp the constitutional change. Now he is in forever. The second most popular way to evade term limits is to use the blank slate strategy of updating the current constitution completely and replacing it with a new one that just happens not to have term limits. According to the article, this was one of the methods employed by former Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir until his ouster last year. After taking power in 1989, he oversaw not one, but 2 entirely new constitutions, and thus remained in power for decades without formally violating term limits. Each time there's a new constitution, his term started over again. You know, we see this one used by municipalities in the United States who use the charter review process to update their cities or counties' organizing documents. That just so happens to leave out term limits in the new version. Or, just like in Sudan, use the new charter as an excuse to start their clock over. A third popular approach internationally is to challenge the legality of constitutional term limits in court. And of course, we see that in the U.S. also. This strategy is particularly popular in Latin America. In Nicaragua, to give one example, Daniel Ortega argued that term limits violated his constitutional rights. The court agreed. Latin American judges tend to defer to their authoritarian caudillos. Who knows what would happen to them if they don't? The last strategy is the most similar to the alleged Trump loophole ploy. The perp in this case will choose a faithful agent, a successor, whom the current president can control. Then the president can step down nominally but retain power until they can legally reclaim it, if possible, or have accumulated enough power to start ignoring the term limits law. The poster child for this approach is Vladimir Putin. Facing an 8-year term limit, Putin stepped down in 2008 from the presidency, temporarily, and turned over the reins to Dmitry Medvedev, while Putin served as prime minister until he could run again in 2012. Now, observers agree that Putin, not Medvedev, was calling the shots during that 4-year period. For one thing, during that period, the Constitution was amended to permit 2 6-year terms, not 4, and returning to power in 2012, Putin claimed his term limit clock had started over and he could legally serve another 12 years until 2024. Well, it's 2025 now, and he's still there. Putin's power is such that the Constitution was amended to accommodate him yet again. Fascinating article. Highly recommended. And you know, it makes you appreciate living in the United States, because even as we rail against our uncompetitive congressional elections, we have a constitutional remedy that we're using to fix it. And even as our most powerful politicians make noise, seriously or otherwise, about refusing to leave office, we can sleep securely at night knowing that we still live in a real democracy under the rule of law.
Like the show? You can help by subscribing and leaving a 5-star review on both Apple and Spotify. It's free.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of No Uncertain Terms. The term limits convention bills are moving through the state legislatures. This could be a breakthrough year for the term limits movement. To check on the status of the term limits convention resolution in your state, go to termlimits.com/takeaction. There, you will see if it has been introduced and where it stands in the committee process on its way to the floor vote. If there's action to take, you'll see a Take Action button by your state. Click it. This will give you the opportunity to send a message to the most relevant legislators, urging them to support the legislation. They have to know you're watching. That's termlimits.com/takeaction. If your state has already passed the term limits convention resolution, or the bill's not been introduced in your state, you can still help. Please consider making a contribution to U.S. term limits. It is our aim to hit the reset button on the U.S. Congress, and you can help. Go to termlimits.com/donate. termlimits.com/donate. Thanks. We'll be back next week.
Find us on most social media at US Term Limits. Like us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and now LinkedIn.
USTL